picture so you can see the two people who are engaging in communication. So you've got the one bubble on the left and the other bubble on the right, and we're hoping that essentially if you've had a successful communication, you're going to have that lovely light bulb in the center. So let's talk about how we get to actually having the light bulb as opposed to having just a fizzle out. So with the elements of communication, we basically start with just a summary definition. You can find one in any dictionary online. You can probably come up with one yourself. But here we've got the imparting or exchanging of information by speaking, writing, or using some other medium. I know some of those words might be a little here nor there, but the main critical point is the exchange of information. So communication happens once you have two or more people that have actually been able to impart and receive information successfully. If you're just going off talking to a wall, I mean, it might be perfectly well recited and you've got lots of great facts and whatnot, but if you're talking to a wall, it's still not communication because you haven't had anyone actually receive it. So this moves into the three components. So we'll just go back and take a look at the three of them on our previous image there. So we've got the sender, the receiver, and the message. So in simplest terms, you can see it right there with the pictures. And that's essentially what you need to communicate. With all the rest of it disappeared, those are what you still have to have. Now, you can communicate in a variety of ways. So we will go into that further into this lecture, into this discussion. So some of those ways are verbal, which is speaking or listening. Nonverbal, which may be observing someone else's behaviors, or as well as behaving yourself, how you hold yourself. We'll go into that. Written, so reading and writing, as well as graphic and visual, which are some aids that you might choose to add, usually as a secondary communication source to a verbal or to something written, just to help a person to clarify and understand something. So here we can see a diagram. We've got the sender and we've got the receiver, like we saw in the previous picture. So the sender essentially is the one with the information. So this person has had something in their mind that they've decided that they have a purpose to share it with the other person or the other people. Now, this whole long box and boxes in here is how your message gets to the recipient. We're going to go into it in pieces so it makes a little bit more sense. But for now, just acknowledge that there's two people and we're trying to channel the information in the most effective way. So we'll start with sending the message. Ultimately, an effective communicator understands their audience and chooses the most appropriate communication channel. Now, when we're looking at this model, it looks like there could be a whole number of different ways that you can communicate. But usually when you're working with a particular individual or you know the setting that you're working in, whether it's with patients or you're speaking to a class or to a friend, you know the way that's going to be most effective. So when you're looking at the appropriate communication channel, you need to present that you understand the audience. So you won't be talking to your son with a big, long whiteboard full of statistics, and you also won't be talking to a patient in a certain way with an email. You might talk to them more immediately. So when you're planning your message, the four main criteria that you need to think about are your objective, your purpose, your vocabulary, and your medium. Now, to break those down into more simple, understandable terms, the objective is your what. So what is it that you're ultimately looking to share or impart with your colleague or your friend? And what is it that you're hoping to get back? So typically when you're going into a conversation, you're going to want to communicate to that person and you're going to want them to respond, because if you just talk to them and they don't say anything, it might not have gone over so well. So the objective is what you're wanting to get out of it. The purpose is your why. So this can be any series of things. Maybe you are at work and you need to communicate necessary information about a particular individual that you're working with. You could be teaching a class, in which case you are all studying together a certain topic. It could be that you're trying to teach a life lesson to your child, or trying to help a friend in a time of need. So your purpose is essentially why you're going into this communication. Your vocabulary is how. So it's pretty self-explanatory that you're not going to use very long, confusing language or acronyms with a child or with someone who has maybe had a hard day. You're not going to want to confuse them, but you want to still be articulate, and you want to be accurate with how you're explaining yourself. So your vocabulary is very important. And then the next piece is your medium, which is a combination of both the how and the when. So you could be speaking face-to-face conversation, which is one of the most common types. That's one of the mediums you can see below. You could be talking over the phone. You could be sending something in an email, but you could also be writing a card. Maybe you're sending a card to a friend who's just had a birthday, or you could be posting a tweet on Twitter or putting a caption underneath of an Instagram picture. All of those are different mediums of sharing your message. And so how those all actually help the when as well is the immediacy. Typically when you're having a face-to-face conversation, it's going to be a more immediate response versus if you're sending an email, you don't know if the recipient is there. So you could be getting your response a little bit later at a delayed time. Now, those are all important aspects to bring into the conversation when you're looking at your audience. So if you are fine to have a response to it tomorrow or the next day, then an email is fine. If you're fine not getting a response, maybe the response you want is a thumbs up, then you're probably going to choose social media. So that's how you can all decide on the medium in which you're going to be doing. And then finally, the most important piece, which I would advise is one of the most important pieces of all communications ongoing, is considering the receiver's perspective. One of the things that I learned early on, and I take into account every time I'm talking to anyone, is put yourself into the receiver, the person you're talking to, into their shoes or their perspective, and imagine how you think they would best receive this information. So if you're used to being more of like an emotional person, you're really good at feeling and explaining your feelings, you're really good at connecting with people, but you're trying to persuade someone of something, or you're advocating on behalf of a topic or concern, then perhaps the person who's receiving that information or the group of people needs something in addition to that feeling, connecting perspective. So you might be needing to reevaluate how you're going to speak and share the information so that you'll be sharing more critical topics and knowledge and statistics and something that you need to actually persuade them. And then flipping that model, if you're really good with facts, you aced all your math classes and you understand you don't even need a calculator to do things, or you're really, really good with lab work, but you kind of sometimes have a little bit of a difficult time, understanding people's body cues and knowing when you need to kind of reach out and maybe give them a hug, then that's something that you can pay attention to as well. It's one of those things you can study body language. It takes a little bit of time. It can be different depending on the person that you're working with, because some people may show more than others. But you definitely need to pay attention to what that other person, the recipient, needs, because that way you'll get your message through a lot clearer, and it's more likely that they'll understand what you're having to say. So we've got some specifics on how to do all of this. So if you want to make sure that you're sharing your message as clearly as possible, it's probably best to speak clearly and concisely. So we don't want anybody mumbling, or, when you just turn away and then people are like, what are you saying? What was that? Or I have the issue with my family pretty much every time I see them, that they'll start the conversation here and then they walk into the other room and they turn the sync on while they're talking to you, and you're like, I have no idea what you're saying. So speaking clearly and concisely, as well as being present and being in the same space as a person, does help to get the message across clearly. Avoid using acronyms, jargon, or colloquialisms. So this could be your slang, but this could also be easy little acronyms. Just because it's in your locality or your immediate vicinity, your group uses these acronyms all the time, or these shortened sayings, it seems like everyone will understand them. But sometimes you've just gotten used to it because your close-knit group has gotten used to it. So if you're telling your grandmother about your EASC class, she'll have no idea what you're talking about, but your particular friend of your group of friends might know that you're talking about earth and environmental sciences. It's the same thing when you work with a certain group of individuals as well. Typically, you have acronyms that help speed up so you can speak more efficiently or get through topics faster. But when you're ultimately trying to share a message, especially if you want it to be well received on the other person's end, and you want to be clear, it's best to just ignore these pieces altogether, the acronyms and the shortened speech, because that way it avoids any confusion potentially. Check your grammar and punctuation, which is a really big one, specifically with your written and any graphic or visual communications that you're doing. I receive emails, lots and lots of emails every day in my position, and there's quite a few of them that I have to go back through and try putting grammar and punctuation marks in different places to see if I understand it best. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. You can always pass it through to a colleague or someone else just to make sure that they understand it, but it just works best off the bat if you check your own grammar and punctuation, and hopefully that's going to forego the extra time that it might take to receive the message. Reread before sending, so this goes into play with that. But the big thing with the reread before sending is also to avoid any potential misunderstanding of tone. So if you are writing an email, it's best to draft it up, get all of your ideas out there. I mean, you could think it's a fantastic email and you want to hit send and get done and get it on, but you can just take 5 minutes even. It doesn't take very long, just take a few minutes. Move on and work on something else. Then come back to it and read it in full, and read it as though you are the person who's receiving the message, and look to see if it seems professional. Does it meet what the audience is looking for? So if the person is, a colleague, does it sound too casual? Have you said something that might be misunderstood or misrepresented depending on the person who's receiving? If somebody else was to read this email, even though it's just between you and one other or two other individuals, if somebody else was to read it, would you feel uncomfortable with that? So it's pretty important to make sure that you reread and you're sending your information in the correct tone that you want. Just in case, because you never know how words can be interpreted because tone isn't there. So it's always how the person interprets it. Then of course use visual or graphic representation if that helps. It could be that you need to use a pie chart. If you're using a lot of data, for most people, learning visually and understanding visually is a lot easier for them than just reading through it if you have all of the details in there. So if you've got like a lot of values or dollar amounts or dates and times, often those will be represented better visually in a chart if you write it that way versus just listing them out in the rest of the content of your email. And it's even the same thing. It starts with your social media as well. So if you haven't gotten to the point where you're writing these long emails with all of this information and whatnot, you can start by using visual representation you probably already have in your Snapchat or your Instagram or whatever you're posting on Facebook. Because I know for me, growing up, when you type in, if you're texting somebody, you type thanks and you put thanks with a period, it's like thanks. And it doesn't read, but then if you put thanks with an exclamation part, you're like, thanks. Well, you don't want to look like you're overly excited. That's just super weird. So you're going to put thanks with your little smiley emoji face because that gets the right middle ground there. So really, your visual and graphic representation can also come across in a variety of different mediums, just depending on who you're speaking to and how you're communicating. So here we have this lovely representation of what we've discussed so far. So it's essentially representing the process of sending and receiving messages through verbal and nonverbal means. So right here you can see the person who's the sender, not just by the little tag that says labeled sender there, but she's also the one who's initiating the conversation. So you can see that she's commented, "Your food smells delicious." So she has processed, she's seen the food that's on the table, she's processed that in her head, and she's now representing it through verbal oral speech, saying your food smells delicious. So that's what the sender has done. But now we're looking at how the receiver is receiving the information, because communication is the two-way street. So it represents how both people are processing this information. So in this case, this individual has interpreted it, they're thinking, oh, she wants to try a bite. That's their interpretation of what she said. But you could interpret this in a whole variety of ways, depending on the day, your mood, the tone, body language that you've received from the sender. It can really vary. So if you put yourself in the shoes of this receiver, this person at the back of their head, they could also be thinking, oh, she said your food smells delicious. Well, she probably wants me to share half of it with her because she just gets ice cream for lunch, so she's hungry. You could also be thinking, oh, well, she gets ice cream for lunch, so she just feels bad for me. So she's telling me that it smells delicious to placate me. Or you could be thinking, maybe she's commenting actually on how much I'm eating, like it's of such a big plate and she's just got this little ice cream. But essentially, you've just received the same words in all of those situations. Your food smells delicious. So it really shows how communication can be taken in so many different ways, that you want to make sure that your message is as clear as possible. So that's why this whole discussion is important, to hopefully narrow down the wide assortment of responses that the receiver could be thinking, because in this particular case, the only feedback you get is thanks. But once you've left the table, the two of them have both left with very different understandings of what just happened. Now, it's up to each person to decide whether or not that was a successful interaction, but it just goes to show that communication can end up with any variety of outcomes. So receiving a message is on the other end. Successfully understanding and receiving other people's messages or communications is a skill as well. It reads into so many pieces, whether you're looking at their body language, how well you know the person, whether you know if they communicate or they tend to communicate in a similar manner in repeated styles. It's very much a skill. It can take a long time to understand how people are communicating. Some people use misleading body language or other nonverbal cues. So this just shows, as well as the previous representation there, that really understanding other people's communication styles can be very difficult. So one way to start with practicing it, because it's a lifelong adventure, is your active listening. So taking in all the information that the sender is conveying with their message. Now here I've got listed just a few examples, but there really is a whole variety of different things you can pay attention to, but particularly tone, body language, inflection, or emotional state. So all of those things will help you to kind of better understand what the person might be communicating to you without actually speaking it or writing it if it's a written one. You could also find out how they're doing, or if you've been working with them regularly, you might know some of this information. Not to mention, active listening helps with memory recall. So I've put that there, and it's just, I'll paint a picture for a minute here. So if you imagine that you've just gotten to work and your coworker, Margaret, has asked you if you can have a chat for a minute. So you're just getting to your office and you've got your coffee, and you need to swirl your coffee because like the syrup's at the bottom and it's kind of gross, and Margaret's talking, and you're typing in your password because you need to get your computer set up because you need to be, started in like 2 minutes, and you've got your pens and stuff, and check your phone. And Margaret's been talking the whole time. Essentially, she's asked you a question and you heard it, so you responded. Now, if Margaret comes back to you a week from now and asks you a follow-up question on that, do you need to jog your memory about what she said? Do you think that she feels like you really heard her? Whereas if you're back in that situation on that same day and Margaret asks you to talk about something, and you look at her and she's got her whole body facing you and she's looking at you with her eyes, you can see that her shoulders might be caved in a little bit. So maybe that's conveying a little bit of vulnerability. Maybe she doesn't usually have her shoulders caved in a little bit. How does she look? How is her face moving? What's the tone she's using? What is the language that she's using? So you hear this message from Margaret and you respond to her, maybe the same way that you would have the first time. But when she asks you a week later and you recall that, you also recall the depth and the importance of the conversation that you had with her. You recall the detail. You remember that she was trembling a little bit, maybe her lip was shaking. You know how important it was, and it was a significant conversation that she was sharing with you. So when you're providing feedback to her, you're more likely to be able to provide something that is truthful and honest and genuine and could have furthered your connection versus what had happened in the first instance. And you will remember it for a longer period of time because of the detail. Receiving written communications is a fair bit different, just because, as we mentioned before, tone is one of those really, really challenging aspects of written communications. So essentially at its core, there is no tone in anything that's written. But you're always going to read things with tone because you're a human and you're always going to interpret things in a certain way. So the best thing to do when you're working in a professional circumstance and you're reading emails or somebody's tweeted and they're from your department or whatnot is to just avoid the tone altogether. Assume best intentions. Assume that they were coming about it with they had, the best intentions that day, and it maybe just kind of came across a little funny. They could have written it differently, but that's fine because I totally know it. Notice your setting, your mood, and your thoughts. So maybe you're reading it a little bit differently as well, too. Maybe the exact same email yesterday, you would have interpreted it differently than you do today. But maybe you had a really bad sleep last night, or you're just thinking about something else that's equally as important, but it's kind of putting your mood in a different way. So think about those things as well when you're receiving written communications. And so active reading is one of those ways that you can learn to overcome some of those issues of reading into tone or inferring tone. So you seek to understand, not to respond. So if you're reading through the information and you're seeking to truly understand it, you're going to spend a lot more time actually listening to it in your head and processing the information versus if you're reading through it just to respond. So it's similar to active listening in that you want to give all of your attention, you're paying all of your attention to those words to try and make sense of it. And you might decide to respond after. You might perfectly be expected to respond, but that isn't the thing that's on your mind, is how you're going to respond when you're reading it. You're first reading it to try and receive the information that was being sent to you. So here we go into nonverbal cues, which is very interesting because you can see here that there are no faces, yet every single one of these bodies represents a completely different mood, and you'd go into a conversation very differently with each of them. So just take a minute to look at how some of these people might project vulnerability, or they might show confidence. They might look like they're a little bit sad or tired or unsure of themselves, and you can get all of that just from the nonverbal body language. So there's a whole bunch of ways that you can process information without the actual spoken words. This can be through facial expressions, gestures, body language, posture, eye movement, as well as paralinguistics, so that's tone, pitch, and loudness, and proxemics and haptics, so that includes your closeness and your touch. So when you're thinking about talking to someone and you're really trying to show them that you're comforting them, how might you use closeness or touch to also comfort them in addition to what you're saying? Do you think if you were the person receiving that communication you were having, you're sad or you're feeling ill or something was just not going great, and a person was reaching out to you and they spoke comfortingly, but they didn't also kind of come in as though they were really caring, would that feel different for you? And then in terms of paralinguistics, the tone and the pitch. So if a person is talking to you and they're very loud, how is that sounding different to you than if their pitch was really high and they're letting their words come out kind of long? Or if they're touching you, it could be different if it's touching you on the wrist or if they're touching on the shoulder. versus if they're giving you a bump, like you were just at the baseball game. All of those things are nonverbal cues of communication that completely alter the message that you're receiving. Demonstrates interest and understanding. And ultimately, when nonverbal signals don't match, this is what creates tension or misunderstanding. The easiest example for this one would be if you're on a date and someone's really into it and someone's not, and the person reaches out because they want to hold your hand and then you don't, and then it's kind of awkward. Well, that's a bit of tension right there. Or it could lead to misunderstanding, ultimately a miscommunication, in which case you could choose to rectify it or not. Here's one of those simple, almost an adage at this point, of husbands talking to each other about if your wife says that she's fine, she's not. So going back to the paralinguistics, even the body language, how are all of those ways, how are you able to translate "I'm fine" in a different manner? So if you were watching a person, they were like, asking them, "How are you?" and they say, "I'm fine," is different than "I'm fine." Is also different than a person coming in close and saying, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you," and touching you on the wrist, or "I'm fine." Those are all different ways that you can communicate the exact same message, but they're completely different meanings. So if you're saying the same thing, but you've got a completely different tone, you need to know that you're sharing your information in the appropriate way to represent your feelings. And when you're reading that message, you're also understanding what they're trying to get across to you. So this moves into miscommunication. So very similar to the last one. One person's saying mouse, the other person hears mouse. And they're not wrong, they're both completely right. They both thought of a mouse. But if these two people were to move apart from each other and not talk again, they think that they had a successful interaction. They were both thinking about a mouse, but not the right kind of mouse. So essentially, it wasn't the most successful interaction. So how do we move past miscommunications? So a miscommunication at its core is the failure to communicate effectively. Oftentimes, the most likely explanation is from noise. So noise is this little concept here that we'll go back to one of the slides at the beginning. Here it is. So you can see here noise, the little Harry Potter lightning bolts. So noise could literally be noise. It could be you're in a coffee shop and this person over here is shouting really loud and this person's clinking their glasses and then the barista's got the steamer going so it's really loud and you're shouting and you're trying to talk to your friend but it's really noisy and they're like, "What are you saying?" So it could be literally that, but noise can also be an internal concept as well. So coming back to the slide here, noise can also be forms of speech. It can be speaking with jargon or buzzwords, speaking as stereotypes, assuming shared understanding. So one example could be you're having a conversation with a friend and they're asking you how work is going and you're like, "Well, I work on 4th, so like, of course." You've just assumed that they know what you're talking about. Maybe all of your coworkers on 4th, or maybe some other nurses or medical personnel in the building know what that means or who was on that floor, but they sound really difficult. But otherwise, I have no idea what you're talking about. So assuming shared understanding is likely something that will lead to a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. Same thing with the acronyms, which we've talked about before. So you don't want to be referring to things in shortened manner, using buzzwords, because it could just be confusing. And essentially, you're taking longer when you use these terms. You're taking longer to communicate effectively or failing altogether. So if the person has to ask you, like, I have no idea what you're talking about, they're representing to you that what you just said didn't work. So you have to start over again and clarify what those terms mean. And then, of course, because communication is a two-way street, not seeking clarity is another issue that can lead to a misunderstanding. So this is why it's important to ask your questions, which we'll get to momentarily. But yeah, it really matters to take the time to think through what the information has been presented to you and whether or not you need to ask questions to seek further understanding. In many cases, you do need to. It happens all day, hundreds of times a day where things are miscommunicated. You could be in a position where you have to ask multiple times to the same person, and it's completely fine, because it's better to ask once than to do something twice. And then once again, the tone and written communications is just one of those really big pieces that can lead to a misunderstanding. So again, just really putting it out there to focus on your tone when you're writing things, and to read another person's emails or letters as without tone. So asking questions is a big one. It's uncomfortable and it can be embarrassing to ask questions, especially if you have to do it a fair amount of times. But asking questions comes down to one of those things that it's really something you need to do, and everyone will need to do for their whole life, through your career, with your personal relationships, because that's how you get clarity and that's how you make sure you're on the same page. It's integral to take the time. So don't feel like even if you're on your first day, and or you're a few months in, honestly, if you're a few months into your position that you're working in and somebody says something to you, they give you a direction, you have the right to take the moment to go through the steps of asking yourself whether you need to ask for the questions or if you understand it. This is with face-to-face communications. This is with social media. Have I interpreted this correctly? Do I understand what this picture is telling me? With the news, very important to always question whether or not you understand that. Do you need to seek further clarity? And with an email as well, you can always send back a response. But it's easiest when you go back to the essential questions. So say someone's given you the directive. So we're back at that position. Who has given it to me? Who do I have to talk to next? Who are all the people I might have to be working with? Do you know all those things? What am I doing? What do I need to do it? When am I doing it? Am I doing it right now? Am I doing it in half an hour? Am I doing it on my next shift? So do I know when I'm doing it? Do I feel like I could recall that information? Do I know where I need to go? Is it on the 5th floor? Is it at so-and-so's office? Is it down the hall at bed 13? Do I know which direction that is? Why am I doing this? Do I understand the whole issue at hand of what's going on? Do I know why I'm here? Is it because of my position? Is it because I work here? Am I being asked to do this because I have a specialty in something? And then how, again, leads from what? How am I doing this? How have I gotten to this position? How might I prepare myself to action what has been directed of me? And so those are all the series of questions that I know it sounds like a lot, like it would be really weird if somebody's telling you to do something and you're like, hold on a second, I'm gonna go through my head. But it really does become second nature, especially with practice. So the more and more you do it, you're gonna go through those quickly and realize, oh, I didn't know where I'm doing this. Like, oh dear, like I need to go back and find out. Or, oh shoot, like they told me to start the IV, but like, who am I doing it for? Which one was it? There's like two or three people who all look kind of the same. I thought it was the right person, but they're all blonde. So who is it? So you can take those moments and actually make sure that you understand all the questions. And it's completely fine to ask the question in any way that you feel comfortable. As long as you're sharing your information, you're communicating truly and from your best self. It doesn't matter if it didn't come across properly the first time. It's fine if it sounded terrible in your head, because you're going to reflect on it and you're going to ask a million more questions in your life, and it's just giving you more practice in your arsenal to see how it takes to ask the question. So if it's your new boss or if it's your coworker and you need to say, oh, where am I going? Don't feel like you're asking me, you're going to be stupid or anything like that. It's completely normal. Even to work in the same place and it's like a hospital and there's a million avenues that seem to look exactly the same, it's completely fine to stop and ask any of the questions. Same thing as if you're in a classroom, if you're in a personal relationship, any circumstance where you're communicating, just make sure that you run through the basic questions and you can ask them in any way that feels comfortable to you. Because as long as you're speaking truly, it will be okay and things will be answered as they need to be. The next biggie is to reflect. So I did mention that for a moment there, but I received advice years ago and I still do the same thing to this day. Anytime I'm communicating with anybody, Immediately afterwards, I reflect on how I feel. Do I think it went okay? Did it like crash and burn? It was the worst communication I've ever had in my life. Do I feel really sick about it? Do I feel happy? Like I feel like I had something lifted off my chest? So reflect about your communication and think about the components of it that worked well. Think about if you felt confident saying something in particular, you can keep that vocab kind of in the back of your mind and use those same words. Think about when you might be in that circumstance again. So big ones are resigning. So say you're resigning from a position. It's not an easy conversation. How did you do it? What did you like about how you did it? Did you feel strong in doing it? Did you feel worried? Is there anything you might try and train yourself to do it again the next time? Because likely more often than not, people resign at some point or a few points in their life and start something new. Is it with a personal relationship? Do you have to have a difficult conversation with them? Think about it afterwards. Think about how you feel, how you could have changed it up. And it again comes back down to speaking your true self. And as long as you're taking the time to think about it before you're saying it, you can take the time to do who, what, when, where, whatever. Then you're taking the right steps to practice your asking questions, and you'll develop that ability. So it does become easier. Feedback is a critical component. So say a person is teaching or a person is speaking to you, it could be in any capacity, you're talking to a friend. Receiving those questions is a form of feedback. So it also helps the person on the other end. They might be like, oh, you know, all of these new people who keep starting on this floor keep asking me the same question. Well, maybe that person needs to develop a little bit how they're explaining it to begin with, and that's completely fine. So it's very necessary to have feedback and question asking as the process of communication. So here we've got a little bit of practice. So I'm hoping that everyone who is here on the call will be able to take a moment, and we'll kind of dissect some pictures here and see how they're going. So we've got this first image, and it's got two ladies sitting at a desk. So if everyone just wants to take a moment to look at the image and think about, do you think that this communication is successful? How do you think they're communicating? So what are some methods? Do you see any nonverbal cues? What is everything that you can point out about this particular scenario?
And I'll just say that everybody can put it into the chat box, and that's probably the easiest way to communicate what you are seeing.
Yeah, that works completely fine. And Kim can say it as well. She can read it out. So again, the questions would be, do you think that they're having a successful communication? Do you think it looks like what has been shared has been effective? And do you see any particular things that the ladies are doing or might be thinking that is helping them to communicate better? Or worse, maybe you see something that shouldn't be done.
All right, so Jade's popped in. I think it is a good communication. Both people are smiling with open body language.
Yep, definitely. So that's your proxemics. So I like that you've mentioned the open body language. So they're reciprocating one another, they're mirroring. You can see that they're making eye contact. So that's definitely it. Did anybody else have any thoughts?
I wrote that they're facing each other.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. That's totally it. That's completely right. So they're having a oral communication. So it's verbal communication, like we discussed at the very beginning, and they're facing each other. It looks like they're happy, so they've received the message. If they haven't, they're both in agreement that it's at least received some good message. So it looks like a successful communication. Here's the second one. Just take a second to look at the picture, the people who are in it. How do you think their conversation is going? How would you feel or react if you walked into a waiting room and this was how a family was sitting?
It looks like the daughter is upset and the mom is frustrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else that people are noticing about it? How would you feel about these individuals if they were in your clinic or waiting room, or you were working in home health?
Jade wrote, I think it is a difficult conversation, but it seems as though both people are comforting each other. They're also using touch by holding hands.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Yep. So you can see the proxemics there. You can see that they're touching one another for comfort. You will likely see people who are reacting like this. You'll see all manner of individuals, especially working in nursing and healthcare. People will be in emotional states depending on what's going on with family members. It's good to pay attention to how they're feeling. You're probably going to want to share information with those people in a slightly different manner than you would if you approached people and they were sitting like this in your waiting room, for example. So you're probably going to want to share that information with a different way. So how we discussed earlier, like you want to share your message in a way that will be best received by the receiver. So you're going to frame that differently. And then if you're talking to this individual, so say she's the emergency contact for a patient that you're working with, and you've just explained to her what's going on. How do you think that communication went?
Maybe she needs more clarification. She looks confused just a bit.
Yeah, yeah, she does look confused just a bit, that's for sure.
Yeah, Jade wrote the same.
Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Andrea. Jade wrote, they appear confused or freaked out by the information provided.
Yeah. So how might you rectify this situation based on the feedback that you're getting from her body language?
I would ask her if she has any questions about what I said or ask her to repeat what I just told her to explain to me.
Yeah, that's one avenue you could do, definitely, making sure that you're getting the feedback. Possibly re-going through the information with a slightly different tone or a different model, or presenting the information in a different way might help. Yeah.
Jade wrote, apologize and try to re-clarify and simplify what you are trying to say.
Yep, so that works. And essentially it comes down to the feedback that you received from her, just from her body language, is that she hasn't really understood it, or she's confused, or she's perplexed, and she's worried. So in this role, of course, it makes sense that you're going to want to re-clarify it with her and make sure that she understands going forward what's going to happen, and she's not so worried about it. So there's any number of ways that you can practice reading people's body language and representing information to them in a different way. So here we have a written communication. So if everyone wants to just read through it really, it's just really short, so read through it quickly and then just let me know what you've understood from this, what you think the other person is conveying. So just whenever you have a second or a thought, how do you think about this person who's written to you, this person who's written the message? What do you think they're getting at?
Jade wrote, it appears to be very condescending.
Yeah, so that's one answer for sure. Is there another one?
Well, she seems like she wants to say something good, but she says something else. Like in the second paragraph, she says we're disappointed, but in the first one, she's like, I know you're busy. So her message is a little bit confusing here.
Oh, it definitely is. And you can definitely read it as condescending, and it's definitely confusing. So we're going to read it in two different ways and just kind of think about it for a second. So what if she's like, Dear Jane, I imagine that you are very busy working with other patients, but my father's health seems to be declining and I want to ensure he gets as much attention as possible. Can you share with me what can be done going forward? Also, we were very disappointed we could not call in to talk to you today. The phone number was incorrect in the email you sent. We look forward to hearing from you. So that's quite condescending and a bit abrupt, and you feel kind of concerned about how to respond. But if you read it in a different way, Dear Jane, I imagine you're very busy working with other patients, but my father's health just seems to be declining and I want to ensure he gets as much attention as possible. Can you share with me what can be done going forward? Also, we were very disappointed we couldn't talk to you today. The phone number was incorrect in the email you sent, but we look forward to hearing from you. So it could very well be that she was meaning to do the latter. And that's why we discussed the tone with your written communications, because it could be that this person just unfortunately has a message that can be read in very many different ways. But at the same time, sometimes it's best to kind of leave it for a second. Think about how you're feeling today, how the whole purpose of your position is to help people, as this woman is requesting, and then go back to it. So fundamentally, what is she actually communicating to you? Without tone, because we've discussed you can't actually read tone in an email because you'll never know for certain which way it was supposed to be intended. So looking at it, she's acknowledging that you're busy. Her father's health is declining, so she's hoping he can get some attention. What can be done? And we look forward to hearing from you. So those are essentially what's actually being said here. There is some questionable language that when you're writing emails can be, other terms could be subbed in instead. So one of those is disappointed. It's just a term that oftentimes when a person reads it, they're going to read it with a negative tone. It has kind of that negative kind of vibe about it. So you might choose a different word. So this is also one of those things, if you were writing this email, you'd written it out and you meant it in perfectly good intentions, and you're going to leave it for 5 or 10 minutes because you've got some other things to do and come back to it. You're going to be like, oh, I imagine you're very busy working with other patients, but my father's health seems to be declining a little bit, and I want to ensure he gets as much attention as possible. Well, maybe in 5 or 10 minutes later, oh shoot, I don't want her to misinterpret that or him to misinterpret that. So maybe I can just reframe it a tiny bit. Maybe I'll take out, we are very disappointed, and just say, we really hope we're able to speak with you today. Maybe that'll be framed a little bit differently. So this is just one of those examples where it shows that written word can be interpreted in any number of ways. And that's why it's important to avoid the tone, because you can recognize it could be any different way that this person had meant it. Assume the best intention and just read what the actual information is saying. Respond to the information, not to what you imagine they might be feeling, because you don't know what they're feeling if they're not physically in front of you or telling you. It can be more difficult sometimes for some people to practice sending and receiving written communications, just because this is such an issue, and especially with social media nowadays, you can put the little smiley face so people know, even if you've said something kind of strong, if you put the smiley face there, you meant it the other way, you're probably not going to write that into an email. So without that, and it just ends on the period, you might be like, oh my goodness, this person's like really mad. But it's important to not do that. Put it aside for 5 minutes, come back to it, and literally just pull out what the actual information is, because you're reading it to understand, not to project potentially how the other person is feeling. Does anybody have any other questions about that? No questions? So ongoing learning. So essentially, communication is an ongoing learning session for your whole life, whether it's in your career, developing your personal relationships with your friendships, anything like that, whether you're posting, you want to be an influencer, your communication style will need to develop your whole life. And it's the same case for every single person. As you're constantly meeting new people, you're learning new roles. So it's one of those skills that just takes time. Everybody's always able to learn something new about it. It's not one that you can finish reading the book and then that was it and then you're good to go. because everybody has different body language or manners of speech. So it's one of those things that you can honestly just always reflect back on every communication that you've encountered. If you feel strongly about it, if you felt like that was really bad, I could have completely done that a different way. Well, why? Why was that so bad? It probably wasn't that bad. It probably was okay, just because everything always seems worse when it's from your own perspective. But if you didn't like it, note it down. You don't have to physically write it down, but you can think, oh, I didn't like how I said that, or I said that too quickly, or I think this missed the mark. So just always feel like you can reflect back on what you were discussing and go from there, because it's constant learning. And here we have our little question owl. So if you have any questions at this time, you can share them by speaking up or by writing it into the little chat box where Kim will see it, or you can also email me if you want to write down my email. I can take questions at any time, and I'm happy to respond to any kind of questions. So feel free to shoot them out whenever you come up with them.
And I encourage you to take advantage of this, because Andrea is communications extraordinaire. So you've got an expert sitting right there at her desk willing to answer. So I would definitely take advantage of this opportunity.
And I love to hear from everyone. So especially in this COVID world, any communications I can get is lovely, because we can't be in person together. So I love to hear from people reaching out by email. So definitely reach out if you want to. But otherwise, that's everything for the fundamentals. So if anyone would like further clarification on the sending and receiving a message, those are some pieces that maybe you feel strong in one and you need some practice on the other. Maybe you want to kind of, even without naming people, say you're having a particular communication or conversation issue right now, and you want to give me the blurb brief overview of it and ask me how you could ask the question to clarify, totally fine to do that too. Anything is good.
And I'm just going to take this opportunity to remind everybody that on February 22nd, we'll do the second part of this series, and that is difficult conversations. I was having problems trying to communicate that, Andrea.
Well, that's fine. I stumble over words too, but it's fine. It works good. I understood.
I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day, because I know how busy your day is. I know how many demands we put upon you, particularly a certain executive director. And so thank you for being willing to sit down and go over the basics of communication, a primer to communication with us. So thank you, Andrea, very, very much.
Thank you. It was really lovely to be here for your webinar, and thank you for your questions and comments with it. And so I hope to hear from people who are viewing now or viewing at a future time.
Jade just wanted you to know, thank you, Andrea. It was very informative, and I cannot wait for the next one. And Bahar says, sorry for showing up late, but it was very informative. Oh,
great. Good. Lovely to speak with you.
All right, everybody, I'm going to sign off, and this webinar will be edited and polished a little bit, and it will be on the members only section, but Bahar, I will also send you a link that you can share with the NNPBC Douglas College chapter group. Okay, everybody stay safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, and we will get through this all together. Thank you again, Andrea, and I say bye to everybody. Bye-bye.